Good morning, and congratulations on braving the challenges of getting here. So, a most impressive and obviously dedicated group to hear, I think, and participate in a conference today that is exceedingly important. I'm Aoun O'Keefe. I am a faculty member at the Syracuse University Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, and a senior advisor here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And it's my privilege this morning to start off the proceedings a bit by setting the framework, if you will, and introduce the moderator for today's events, Andrew Hunter. But my objective, I think, first and foremost, is to thank Northeastern University and my colleagues here at CSIS for sponsoring a very important conference, I believe, to exploring the means to strengthen relationships between the government, industry, and our universities to yield innovations to address national security capabilities. This is a time when that may be more significant a challenge than ever before by virtue of the evolution of each of those three sector institutions. My experience leading organizations in the government, as Secretary of the Navy, as the NASA administrator, later as the Chancellor at Louisiana State University, and thereafter as the CEO of the Airbus U.S. division here in the United States, gave me a familiarity with the challenges of all three of those sectors, and in terms of the issues that needed to be confronted to avail where the capabilities resided best and how to best identify the nature of options and capabilities in order to yield solutions that were being sought in any of those triangular kind of issues. And so I saw that over the course of those experiences in the public sector, in the private sector, and at universities, that all three sectors routinely demonstrated to me the extraordinary value of partnering relationships as a means to leverage those opportunities to describe the nature of issues and the imperative that's being sought, as well as the solutions to be derived. Over the decades, certainly in the modern era now, the capabilities of both government and industry have really evolved dramatically from being a largely government as either a provider as well as consumer of research and development related activities to now becoming one of many consumers and far less one of the typical providers and as organic and incapable or in-house capabilities that would be evolved. Industry has become more and more focused, as it should, in many respects by the pressure of the competition as well as the global economic challenges of competing towards very, very specific kinds of innovations and technical solutions to near-term identifiable problems, which then provides an extraordinary opportunity at universities, which has always demonstrated a prowess in the field of both basic as well as applied research, to view those opportunities and leverage those capabilities to very specific issues as well as broader challenges to be overcome or limitations to be exceeded as you move forward in trying to develop capabilities to meet present-day challenges. The government, I think, comes to focus on the challenges now to define capabilities required and develop the means to access product and process improvements from industry, as well as that broader basic research and applied research from universities. The most effective mechanism I found in all three sectors, leading organizations in each, was to find a very effective formulation of all three sectors in a partnering arrangement. The mechanism by which the capabilities of each are relied upon very specifically for the purpose of then leveraging those capabilities going forward. And perhaps equally important in many respects is the capability and the imperative for talent management within each of those three sectors. The opportunity for universities to have a partnering arrangement with industries that are constantly seeking to refresh the technical capabilities that may be resident within the various companies and their competitiveness, in the government as a mechanism to provide the means for principal investigators for the purpose of exploring those opportunities that they have a specific expertise in, and at the same time that may be a finite period of time in which that's provides an extraordinary opportunity to see that talent management opportunity to be leveraged among those three sectors and at all times, and to create that awareness among all three sectors for the purpose of where that talent resides, and to have the opportunity to apply that talent in those cases in which it is most imperative at the time. So for all those reasons, again, this is an incredibly important conference in my mind that focuses on that very specific part of partnerships in order to yield those innovations. And the best way to do so is to figure out how best to strengthen those partnerships going forward. With that, I'd like to introduce my colleague and friend here, Andrew Hunter, who is the Director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group and Senior Fellow in the International Security Program here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Andrew?
All right, thank you, Sean, for kicking us off with those great thoughts on this critical partnership. And thank you, everyone, for joining us, and as Sean said, fighting through the disruption today to make it to today's event. And we know that there's likely a robust audience viewing this online as well. We're going to keep you in mind throughout this event. And as I'll mention, we are going to have questions able to be submitted online as well, because the theme of today is partnership. And a kind of a sub-theme of that is also dialogue. Our two panel sessions have both been set up to be dialogues, and we want that dialogue to include those of you who are currently viewing this online. And so we're going to make that possible. Let me make a few administrative notes before we dig deep into this substance. The first is, as Sean noted, that our partner co-hosting this event and whose support made this event possible is Northeastern University. You'll see their logo at the top of our graphic that we have here in the room. I also want to point out on our graphic that we have included a recommended hashtag to use for those of you who might be tweeting of the two sessions, the remarks that are being made. We would be delighted if you would feel free to use those hashtags. We have also included the link to the online questions. It's the bit.ly link that is on what would be my left, those of you facing the graphic on the right in blue. And so we hope that you will feel free to use both the Q&A link and the hashtag for any social media that you'll be doing today. I also want to let everyone know, as we always do here for events at CSIS, that we do have a security plan in place. So it's hard to imagine there could be anything that would be more disruptive than what you've already been through in getting here. But if something were to occur that would cause us to need to leave this room for any reason, I'd be your security officer and give you further guidance about going either out the way you came in or out the back. But we don't anticipate that. As I mentioned, we were going to have Q&A for both the panel discussion that comes after this and for our initial discussion with President Aoun and Dr. Walker. And so be prepared, get your questions ready. The two different panels are identified on the link. You can submit a question to either one, and there are separate entries for the two panels. And I will also have a few questions of my own to throw at folks and keep them on their toes. I want to introduce our first two panelists, President Aoun and Dr. Walker. I'll start with President Aoun. President Joseph Aoun is president of Northeastern University. And by the way, both organizations, Northeastern and DARPA, I think are really exemplars of the kind of partnership that we're talking about today. And I'll talk a little bit about how that's true for both. Northeastern is a global experiential research university that's built on a tradition of engaging with the world, and they have a distinctive approach to education and research. They have campuses in the Boston area, but also in Charlotte, Seattle, the Bay Area, Toronto, Vancouver, and most recently London. So they are truly global. There's a few parts of the world they haven't conquered yet, but they're getting there. They're on their way. And then what they do across their programs is integrate global experience into undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral level learning programs through a co-op program approach, which alternates periods of full-time career-aligned work experiences with traditional classroom study. So students alternate between doing work that is immediate that is work directly in industry and applications with classroom study in alternating periods, and includes global study as well. And this partnership model, which they have really pioneered, they have really brought to the national security arena by building an innovation campus that focuses on a range of issues, including among them national security. They have partnerships there with all of the military service branches. There is a campus or a center for the Army Research Lab that is co-located there with Northeastern. And they also do a lot of work with the Air Force and with other military service branches, taking this co-op approach, this direct experiential partnership approach that we want to really focus on today. President Aoun is a higher education thought leader, is the 7th president of Northeastern University, has been there, I believe, for 14 years now. Prior to that, served as a university chair at USC, and is the author of a number of books, the most recent of which is Robot Proof: Higher Education in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. And we will spend, I think, a little bit of time talking about artificial intelligence, human-machine teamings, and some of those issues as, again, an exemplar of the way in which these different members of this partnership are working together. Dr. Stephen Walker is director of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, better known as DARPA. He has been director of DARPA since November 13th, 2017 as the full-time director. Prior to that, he was the acting director from January 17th until being formally appointed as the full-time director. And prior to that, he was a deputy director of DARPA from October 2012 to December 2016. So he is about as steeped, I think, in DARPA as you can get. Has served as a program manager there previously, before he reached the lofty ranks of the executive office. Prior to returning to DARPA in 2012, Steve served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Science, Technology, and Engineering. And he was responsible for developing the technology investment strategy of the Air Force's roughly $2 billion annual science and technology program, and also serving as the functional manager and advocate of more than 14,000 military and civilian scientists and engineers. He has more than 30 years of experience in the civil service, began his career in the Air Force Research Laboratory Air Vehicles Directorate in Dayton, Ohio, a location that's it's fun to visit. I can testify, having been there, to part of some of our engine project research. Fascinating place, incredible work being done. And he spent time as program manager in the hypersonics research area and responsive and affordable space lift as well. So he has really worked at the nexus where these different elements of the partnership come together to drive innovation. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome them to the stage. They're going to have a dialogue, and then I will facilitate your questions.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Well, thank you all for being here, and we're going to start, the discussion and the dialogue. The first point is, why are we here today? We are here today to stress the importance of national security in an academic setting And the second question based on that is, how are we going to be able to do it? The answer that we are entertaining is that the only way to do it is via partnerships. Now, you know that for every partnership, we need various actors to play together, to work together, and at the same time, each partner needs to see that they are getting something out of it. It has to be a win-win-win situation. And this is what brings us together. We have representatives from universities, from industry, and from mission-driven agencies, and it's an honor to have you, Dr. Walker, with us today. So let me start very briefly by mentioning that in academia, our relationship with mission-driven agencies is a little bit uneasy. And we want to receive the funding, but we don't want the restriction that comes with it. Therefore, the question is it a sustainable model to keep doing it in this way? Well, we believe that there are alternatives. And that's what we will be discussing today. And Dr. Walker is here to talk to us about not only his vision for DARPA, but how he also works, and he would like DARPA to work with companies and with universities. At the same time, during this dialogue, we will offer maybe different models that could be very enticing to all the parties to explore. So without further ado, let me start by welcoming one more time Dr. Walker. It's an honor to have you here. And you have outlined very direct priorities for DARPA. And those are research priorities. Would you like to start a little bit by sharing with us how you view the mission of DARPA and how these priorities fit with respect to this mission?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Joseph, and thank you, CSIS, for also having me as well. I love the title of the conference, Implementing Innovation, because you can be innovative, but if you don't implement it, if you don't apply it, if you don't use it, what's the use? To your point, mission, DARPA, develop breakthrough technologies for national security. That's really been our mission for 61 years now, and we take it very seriously. When I became director, I outlined 4 key areas that I wanted DARPA to focus on, and for those of you who know DARPA, you know it's a very bottoms-up organization. We really go out and hire the best and brightest people we can find, bring them in, and we don't hire them just on their backgrounds. We hire them because of the ideas they have, right? And the ideas they can bring to national security. So we get a lot of our program ideas and what we do from our program managers, but it's important for the leader of the organization to say, here's what I care about. So the 4 areas that I laid out: defend the homeland against existential threats. And so when you think about cyber, you can think about dirty bombs in cities. You can think about bio threats to the country and how to defend against those. Those are sort of what I include in terms of defend the homeland against existential threats. The second area, and the area that DoD is talking a lot about, is the competition with peer adversaries. And so how to prevail if necessary, but really before prevailing, deterring an event with a peer competitor. And so that's about things like hypersonics and things like having a robust space architecture, controlling the electromagnetic spectrum, which Northeastern is helping us with in terms of allowing radios to communicate with artificial intelligence and to deconflict from one another. That's what those pieces are about. The third area was effectively getting better at stabilization efforts across the globe. Since 9/11, we've been focused on trying to stabilize societies and counter terrorism. How do we get better at that? Because we're doing a lot of it. And how do we do it more efficiently? And the fourth area is really where we connect with the university community, and that is winning the tech races of the 21st century, our foundational research. And so you can think artificial intelligence, which DARPA has been funding for about 56 years, I believe. Electronics, and how do we have the best electronics for our systems that we need moving forward. Quantum computing and alternative ways to compute. And then this whole area of biotech, and how do we engineer biology to use it to protect US soldiers, for instance. And so these are the sort of the higher level strategic areas that I set out for the agency that I wanted our folks to focus on and bring me ideas in to answer your question. But in all those areas, I want to be innovative, and I think DARPA has some key ingredients on how we've been innovative over all these years, which we could talk about later, but I want to apply that innovation. And so everything we do, from the most basic work at universities to advanced development, we have a purpose, and we try and answer the question, what problem are we trying to solve, right from the beginning? And I think that can motivate good, basic, open research as well.
Great. So, we say that innovation without execution is hallucination, and that's what you were mentioning here. So, how do you deal precisely with the transition from innovation to execution?
Well, it's not always easy. Let me just say, you can be innovative and you can produce, the greatest widget in the world. How do you get the customer, which in our case, the customer is the warfighter, how do you get the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps to take that new widget and do something with it, fight a different way? They have a much harder problem than I do. I can invent the widget. They have to actually learn how to train with it, how to educate their workforce on it, and make it robust and reliable. And so it's a back and forth, it's a give and take. But I think it's really, really important because it's part of the role of the government in this three-legged stool of government, academia, and industry. Part of the role of government is to lay out the problem set in national security, lay out the problem set, and develop the strategic approach to actually not just being innovative, but taking it all the way. And that requires the different parts of the government to work together and partner. Sean O'Keefe said this is about partnerships, and I agree. Sometimes the hardest partnerships are inside the government. But that is required in order to have this implementation path, right?
So DARPA is loved by universities, and you love us back, but if there is anything, any dimension that you would wish universities to further in their relationship with DARPA?
Well, universities are, when I think, again, the three-legged stool, universities provide two things to DARPA and the broader national security community, I believe. One is ideas. So we talk about DARPA, former director Tony Tether liked to talk about DARPA bridging the gap between the far side ideas and bring that into the warfighter's capability space. I believe the universities provide those far side ideas. I was a program manager of basic research for the Air Force. Along the lines in my career, dealt exclusively with universities. The ideas were generated there and then typically brought into DARPA to apply. So that's one thing. Workforce is the second thing. So you provide the people, the educated people that go to industry or go to government to help us solve national security problems. We need you to keep doing that. We need you to keep attracting the best and brightest from all over the world, actually, to do that. And we have several, within DARPA, we have several programs. One I'm thinking of right now called the JUMP program, which is in our microelectronics space, which is focused on working with industry. It's a 60% funded by industry, 40% funded by DARPA. That basically is money going to universities in the electronic space, working on open, publishable work. But what it's really doing is providing that next generation of scientists and engineers that want to work on national security problems. And that's important to the government, but also industry.
Not everybody is like Sean, who did it all, being a university president, at the same time being in industry. When you look at the triangle involving industry, DARPA, and universities, do you think that this triangle is functioning well, or is there anything more that we can do together?
Well, I think it functions pretty well. I think DARPA does a really good job at developing new research communities with the academic community, with industry, small and large companies. We are, for instance, in the media forensics area right now, we have been funding mostly universities and academic institutions, small companies, using AI to develop ways to understand deep fakes in pictures and videos. And the Googles and Facebooks of the world are interested, but we're providing that sort of foundational knowledge base now and working with those companies to make sure they have the latest and greatest tools to fight this issue. I think DARPA does a really good job at that. Universities, I've been a bit interested in your model that I'm hearing about, which is creating a place where you can do classified work and leaving it up to your professors and faculty whether they want to engage in that way. That's certainly, I think, a way we can plug into university talent and have them work on national security problems. That is a plus for DARPA, and that helps DARPA and that helps all of DoD be better. So I would encourage that type of thinking. You might want to say a little bit more about what that is.
Well, thank you, Dr. Walker. The idea being that we have a campus focusing on security, where we can do sensitive and classified research. And the model is that from day one, we built the campus with mission-driven agencies. Dr. Perconte is here because the Army Research Lab is housing its Northeast operation there. At the same time, we have companies that embedded their talent there, and their researchers. And obviously, we invite the researchers in the university to be there. Now, the question is, why would it be relevant and impactful for a faculty member and a postdoc and a graduate student and a research faculty to be part of this operation? And the idea is that this is leading us to rethink the notion and the interplay between fundamental and applied research. Traditionally, as we all know, in academia, we believe that there is a kind of immediate translation from the fundamental to the applied. It's easy. I master the world because I have the fundamental. Let me go apply it. When you start applying it to real products, to prototypes, etc., you are realizing that you have to rethink your fundamental research. And therefore, an interplay between the fundamental and the applied is essential. For companies, what they are looking at is from day one, when they have embedded researchers, and we have companies that have their research operations completely embedded there, they are working at the forefront, as you said, Dr. Walker, of the research, but also pushing for the application side and the product side. So it's a win-win situation, and with the mission-driven agencies, and Dr. Perconte once again is here, we are working on precisely the priorities that were determined there. Now, so that's step one. Step two is that it's leading us also to rethink the way we work on IP and intellectual property. From day one, with our privileged partners, we don't negotiate the IP. We have an agreement that the IP is yours up to a certain threshold, and therefore come and let's work together and let's build the solutions. So that's the approach. This approach has been very impactful, very successful, and we have been growing. And what's interesting is that the faculty and the postdocs and the research faculty and the students have been very receptive, because it's not a mandate, it's an invitation. If you want to partake into that, you're welcome to do it. So they shape the intellectual agenda, but they shape it with the mission-driven agencies and with the companies from day one. So that's the model that we have been working on. And so far, it has been very impactful, and other universities, and some of them are present today, have been asking us to explain how we did it. So it requires humility. It requires listening.
And what I've found over the years working with academic institutions is professors, maybe there'll be a professor in here that disagrees with me, which is fine, but they generally like to work on projects that DARPA funds, or as you say, mission-driven agencies fund, because the problems are very interesting.
Yeah.
The students, postdocs, and others get excited about solving those kinds of problems, and they can actually get quite a bit of resources associated with solving a very critical problem for DoD and for national security. And so they can build up a lab, they can build up a team, they can attract more postdocs. So they generally have a positive experience. The downside sometimes I hear from them is, well, you have metrics and you hold us to that at the review time, and yes, we do. But we generally are understanding about letting grad students finish, and et cetera. But it can be an exciting project for them and their students to work on compared to sort of the other stuff.
So Dr. Walker, I wanted to focus on something you said that has been very important for the universities. Essentially, you said keep bringing the talent and bring the talent wherever it is, namely on a global scale. We live in an environment where there is clear competition, there are tensions, and at the same time there are issues in terms of visas, etc. How do you think we can negotiate that?
It's a tough problem. It's, as long as most of the best students in the world are coming here, I feel good about that. That's a good thing. We want to continue to tap into the best and brightest. In some countries like China, they're making it more attractive for those kids to go back home, right, and start research labs there. And so I don't think we're getting quite as many kids coming here, being educated and staying as we used to, which is a problem, I think, right? I don't think it's a problem to get them to come and do the research here. I think it's a problem if they leave. So whatever we can do to help solve that, but I think that's a strategic thing the country needs to get its arms around, and it's been difficult to do.
And speaking of competition, for instance, in AI, there are people saying, look, we are far ahead in terms of fundamental AI, whatever that means, but we are lagging, the competition, including China, in terms of applied AI. And one domain is the example of facial recognition that you alluded to. At the same time, people are saying, look, because they are focusing more on the applied aspect, they can leapfrog, with respect to us. And when you look at the competitive landscape, where do you think we are, and what do you think we ought to do?
That's a tough question, but I still think in AI we're ahead. I believe in the foundations of AI and the research. We are still leading the world. There's certainly no question that China specifically is doing better and catching up and investing heavily in that field. But I still think we're ahead. I believe that from an application standpoint, they may have an advantage in that they don't have the same privacy issues that we do, which I wouldn't. I'd rather have the privacy issues we have and the ethics that we have here and work with those. But they don't have as many of the privacy issues, so I think they can build the databases and train their systems maybe quicker and more effectively than we've been able to do. I know in biology, for instance, biotech, they're collecting a lot more data than we are. So That's an issue we need to think through for the future. I will say where I think DoD is from a foundation standpoint, DARPA invests, I think it's now, gosh, $350 to $400 million a year in the foundations of AI. We have an AI exploration program that we've developed where we put out a topic every month, and it's on our website. It's getting a lot of university participation in that work, but it's an 18-month, $1 million, let's go try something and see if it works. That is really focused on what we consider to be the third wave of AI. DARPA's been funding it for a while, I said. First wave is really expert learning systems. Second wave is really what we're seeing now being applied, which is machine learning. And the third wave is really how do humans and machines interface? How do we work together as partners? And in fact, we use the word partner in how we want to see AI evolve in this third wave. And so these AIE topics are all about that human-machine partnership. And I believe we've published 9 now over the last year. Again, once a month, you can submit a proposal. It's pretty short. And within 90 days, you will be awarded a contract. And we've held to that so far. And so it's a great way for universities, especially with some postdocs, to go try something quickly, turn it around, and then we hope that those will mushroom into the big DARPA programs that are multiple performers over many years. We're definitely focused on AI. I'm the co-chair of the President's Select Committee on AI with France Cordova, NSF. And so the country, the administration is taking it seriously as an area we want to lead and continue to lead in. But your question about application and what some of our peer competitors are doing is a valid one. My deputy likes to say AI is especially the foundations of AI, it's math, right?
Yeah.
It's really hard to protect math, and so it's going to be out there and for all to use. And so whoever uses it first and will have an advantage. We always want to make sure that we're not straying away from our ethical values and how we use it, though.
So, for instance, when we look at China, when you look at Europe, there is a massive investment, for instance, in China in creating centers for AI, in also training people in AI. Billions of dollars are being invested. The Europeans, are focusing on that too, one way or another. And we have various agencies, and clearly DARPA is a leading one with a clear strategy for AI for the nation. And there are implications, we discussed them together, implications with respect to research, with respect to remaining leaders, but also with respect to the human factor, namely AI is going to impact the workforce. Certain studies are saying that up to 50% of the job, as we discussed, are going to disappear or be completely transformed. And therefore, there is a massive work being done in various countries all over the world on an AI strategy that is also human-centered. Now, when we look at what we have here in the nation, we have DARPA, we have NSF, we have mission-driven agencies. Does it amount to a national strategy, or do we need to bring that together into a national strategy? And is this what you are referring to?
Well, I think it's starting, and I think under the leadership of the CTO, Michael Kratsios, who has put this select committee together, it's the closest thing we have, I think, as a nation to looking at all the different pieces of AI. So workforce issues, ethics is part of that, and then the foundational work and applied work. So it's on the web, you can go look at it. We, DARPA, because of this overall national strategy, select committee committed to putting even more funding into the research side of it. That's our role. So other government agencies I know are looking at that and trying to step up and do their piece. But it's going to require, as I said earlier, when you talk strategy and you talk setting problem sets and initiatives, it's going to require different pieces of the government to come together and say, here is the government strategy. And I would say we struggle with that sometimes because our system is really decentralized. And there are good parts about that. I think it's more innovative because of that.
Absolutely.
We let 1,000 flowers bloom, and we see which ones pop up and are successful. But the trick is then finding those successes and applying them in strategic ways. And that's what we've got to be mindful about doing.
You were asked, if you want to focus on a moonshot approach, and everybody assumed that you were going to say AI, and you said the life sciences.
What did I say? Oh, okay.
Yeah, the life sciences, synthetic biology, synthetic biology, and gene editing, CRISPR, etc. And then, beyond that, also how we can, the human-machine interface, even in this domain, through the mind-brain, etc. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I think I might have referred to the life sciences because that's the area where I see the most incredible technical leaps and bounds every day. The whole gene editing area, we have several programs at DARPA looking at how to make gene editing safe and actually reverse a gene edit if we need to. And so, you might think gene editing and biology and NIH has billions of dollars. Yes, that work is ongoing, it's being funded, but it's not sort of maybe as purpose-driven, right, as we would like. And so this program manager, Renee Wegerson, said, I want to first understand gene editing and how it works better, so the CRISPR-Cas9 and all that, and the different ways to do it. Because part of DARPA's mission is prevent technological surprise. And so in order to prevent it, you got to understand how it works first. And then how do we reverse it if we need to reverse it, if it gets out into the wild and gets out of control? And so that's what the Safe Genes program is all about. And so we've actually made a lot of progress there in being able to control gene edits. And that will, I think, change our world in the ability to actually cure disease. And we're actually looking at it can you actually protect a soldier in the battle? Why is DARPA doing this? Could you actually protect a soldier in the battlefield from chemical weapons and biological weapons by controlling their genome? Having the genome produce proteins that would automatically protect the soldier from the inside out. And so just the amount of technological change in that area and the ability, the more capability we have to engineer biology for use is why I think it's just the most exciting field at DARPA right now, and why we stood up an office in 2014 to focus on it. Gene editing is just one piece. We're also looking at infectious disease. How do you develop a vaccine in 60 days or less for 20,000 people for a virus that you've never seen before? So this is about being able to inject the cells in your muscles, say, to produce antibodies automatically for a vaccine that we've never seen before, and do it in 60 days or less to protect a large population. So this is work that we've been funding for about 10 years at universities, and now we're seeing, and we're going into clinical trials with this as we speak. And so, and then the whole neuroscience area. Been able to show that people can control robotic prosthetics just by thinking about it. How does that translate into a pilot in a cockpit being able to think about making a maneuver and actually doing it, being able to, and this feeds into the whole human-machine partnership area. How do humans and machines work together in the future to do different tasks? And again, from a military perspective, trust is going to be a really, really important thing. So if I've got an AI system and I'm supposed to use it to somehow protect my platoon, I'm going to really have to trust that system before I use it. And so we've got lots of programs in AI explaining itself to the human, AI telling the human, you've asked me to do something I know I can't do, AI protecting itself against being manipulated by an adversary. And so lots of programs in that space that universities are in the front line helping us with.
So before we open it up for one more question, we have the young minds, I know that, looking at you, listening to you, and thinking about their future. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey? You know, you had options. How did you decide to end up where you are today?
Sure. Well, I received an Air Force ROTC scholarship to go to Notre Dame, and the tuition was really expensive back then. It was $6,000 a semester. But I got a scholarship, and I just had to pay room and board. And I ended up going to work for AFRL, Air Force Research Lab in Dayton, Ohio, which is where I was from. And my dad had been an aerospace engineer, so I kind of followed in his footsteps as an aerospace engineer. But I really have never looked back because, again, 32 years in the civil service, you get to move around, do lots of different things every 3 or 4 years if you want. You don't have to, but if you want, which is kind of what I've done. And you have one retirement system, so it's great. But the problems are incredibly interesting, and the feeling you get by solving a problem for a young airman or young sailor, young Marine, and going out and talking to them and seeing how what you do impacts their everyday life is really satisfying. And so I never really considered, going out and developing clickbait for the web. It just doesn't compare. And so if you have a passion for the country and for keeping it safe, I would highly recommend government service.
Great, thank you, Dr. Walker.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for that dialogue, and we're going to keep it going, and adding in some questions. And I may not have hit on this earlier, but we're going to do a mix of old school people in the room asking questions with microphones and online. I'm going to, for audience questions, I'm going to start with an online one. But before I do that, I can't resist just one of my own that I wanted to throw at you, because Dr. Walker, you said something very intriguing earlier about seeding the space, both in industry and academia, in different technology areas that are of concern for DARPA. And you also talked about how you hold your the recipients of your funding accountable to metrics, but how does DARPA measure whether they succeed? If your goal is to seed a technology area, how do you measure whether you've had success with a program and achieved that objective?
That's a great question. We don't measure, actually. We tell stories, actually. They're mostly true. But it really is hard to measure transition. Well, our metric is transition. Do we get technology over the finish line and help our warfighters? By the way, that is the national security mission, and it's important. We don't do anything unless it's for national security. There's a lot of side benefits to what we do that help the overall economy, the internet being one. So we try and tell stories about where we've been successful, but we also tell the failure stories too, because if you're trying to change the world, which is what we say we try and do in our programs, you're going to fail a lot. If you're trying to have a big impact on the world, you're going to fail a lot. One of my former bosses said if I could do low-risk, high-impact programs, I'd do them all day. But we generally do high-risk, high-impact programs. And so I think we did a look over the last 10 years, and about, if you consider lots of different paths to transition, so directly to a program of record or through the commercial space or to a place like ARL that takes it to the next step. If you consider all those different paths to transition, we transition about 60% of what we do. But if you look at direct transition to a program of record into a warfighter's hand, it's much lower than that. So sometimes it takes time, as we all know, in this business. Sometimes you're focused on solving a problem in a basic research space, and you work on it for 6-7 years, and And it turns out not to solve that problem, but it solves a bunch of problems over here, right? So it's hard to measure this stuff, but I'm thankful. I think I'm the 21st director of DARPA. I'm thankful that the White House, the Congress, both sides of the aisle, the Pentagon, has given DARPA the autonomy and the trust that it needs to actually accomplish our mission. So that is a huge piece of why we're successful.
I'm going to ask one from the online submission, and whenever we have folks ask questions, we always say, please tell us who you are. So this question is from Russell Reed, the Washington Examiner, and it gets at something you've referred to a couple times. It gets at how much China and the government-led investment in technology and how much that has grown. And given that the National Defense Strategy focuses on potential peer adversaries like China, how does that kind of change the way you think, or does it change the way you think about DARPA's investment? You mentioned preventing technical surprise. How does it shape the way you approach your programs?
Well, certainly, yeah. One of the reasons why we were created in 1958 was because of Sputnik, right? And the Russians put up the Sputnik satellite in '57. Dwight Eisenhower said, I need a place that's located in the Central Department of Defense that can help prevent technological surprise to the country. So one of the ways we have thought about doing that over the years is to create technological surprise. And so I believe the best way to compete with our peer adversaries is to win those tech races of the 21st century, to stay ahead. And to win those tech races, we can't do it by protecting everything. It's not going to work. We need to do it by continuing to lead, continuing to work with the academic community, DoD laboratories, industry, both small and large companies, continuing to have the best people come to this country, produce for this country, even if it's academic, open, basic research. It's the job of the national security then infrastructure, DoD laboratories, the defense industrial base, DARPA, to take that open research, apply it in ways that we need to for national security, and we can do that in a protected environment. So we've got to be confident in the infrastructure and the organizations that we've built over 60 years, and continue to strengthen them and to move them forward together. That's the only way we're going to win. And I think we're still in the lead. We got to stay there, right?
I'm going to open up to questions in the room, and I'm going to start with Jason. He's standing right next to me, so I'm just going to hand him the mic. But for everyone else, the mics will come from back.
Hi, Sidney Friedberg. That's all right. I look like a Jason. But
Could you say what you do?
sure, I am a reporter, so I'm a professional asker of obnoxious questions. Mr. Director, first of all, thank you very much for talking today. I wanted to pull on the biotech in a few ways. One question is, how does that tie into AI? I imagine the advances in computing are an important part of figuring out the genome or enabling that. And two is, the devil's advocate question. Great, we can figure out how to make, tomatoes repel bugs or humans perhaps generate proteins. Why, given the complexities of working on the human, both ethical and practical, is it better to modify the human, or has more potential to modify the human, than just hand the human an ampule of something and say, hey, if you're afraid of nerve gas, stick this in your arm?
Yeah.
Why is making the human the pharmaceutical factory worth the agony involved compared to just issuing everyone a pouch full of different things they can ingest?
Sure. Let me start with the second question first, and then you'll have to remind me what the first question was. The second question, the reason why we want to start with a human is to do what you said, which is have a shot available for every case that might be out there, is becoming more and more intractable, because with synthetic biology and the ability for folks anywhere in the world to make something that's slightly different than what it was before, you can't stockpile enough vaccine or the antivirus capability to protect the population against that in the future. So that's why we want to be able to, and this is all research at this point. We don't have the capability yet, but that's why you want to be able to actually have your body be the antibody factory, if possible. What was the first question again?
Well, I'll follow up on that one. Also,
Could you use the phone? We have folks.
sure. People talk about
But that means that you have 3 questions now. So stay with the first 2 because others would like to ask questions, if it's okay with you.
Yes, well, human enhancement, as opposed to the antibodies or the biodefense aspect, is that again an area where we would want to have the human be producing the pharmacological enhancements instead of the way athletes do it now, which is various ampules of things.
Yeah, I think our focus is about the protection aspect and the restoration versus enhancement. And I'll just say, in all these technologies, they're dual use, right? You can use them for good, you can use them for evil, and DARPA is about using them for good to protect our warfighters.
Hi, my name is Emma Bates. I'm a program manager and research associate here at the Project on History and Strategy. My question is, in the context of it's springtime for the Cold War analogy for the US-China competition, how do you think the paradigm of government investment in technology needs to change to meet the kind of investment juggernaut that China faces? And specifically, do you think we need to have a new version of the very profligate 50s and 60s that led to the space program and the internet and all of that? And do you think we invest government funds at the right stage of innovation right now across the different areas of government that do that? Thank you.
Let's see, the last question, investing at the right stages. I see government investment as really investing in the long term. That has traditionally been the role, and certainly DARPA's role in really, we're going to take a long-term view. We're going to make investments that are really high risk and that maybe the commercial sector wouldn't make. And so a lot of times people compare us to DARPA to venture capitalists. It's really not true because venture capitalists have a pretty short-term view of the world. 6 months, they want to see a payoff. DARPA's investing for 20 years. And so I think government investment should stay in that space. I mean, it should be focused on the longer term. Now, the laboratories, DoD labs, have a little bit of a different mission where they are also focused on the near-term needs of the warfighter, and so that's slightly different. I forget your first question was about how do we compete with China and their investment levels?
Do we need kind of a new NDA, very expensive investment?
I see.
Throwing a lot of money at the problem.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a believer in just throwing money at a problem because the money can be poorly spent, right? I think focused and directed investment in key areas is important. I think the department has taken that approach in the area, say, of hypersonics. We are focused, we're investing, and we've developed a strategy to not just do the first pieces, but actually get it into capability. So that's an area where I see a lot of promise. And I've been in hypersonics a lot of my career, and I've now over the last couple years seen a very strategic focus, which is great. We don't have that in every area. I would love more money at DARPA, but I think you get to a point though where we have a good model, it works for us, and the money we have should be sufficient to make a difference.
Let me add another question from our online questioners. This one's from Dom Orsini from US Crest. And the question is that differentiating the roles of the service labs from what DARPA does is directed to Dr. Walker, but President Aoun, given that you've worked with DARPA and with service labs, I'd be interested in your perspective as well.
I've worked in both. AFRL, I started my career, I was there 9 years. AFRL did incredible things, but it had a couple different missions. It was a research and R&D organization. It was the smart buyer for the Air Force, right? It had the experts in the Air Force that could look at a Lockheed proposal or a Boeing proposal and say, they're right here, they're not right here. But it did, I use the term incremental innovation. I think incremental innovation is a very good thing. When I was there, I worked in a propulsion group. Our job was to develop the next inlet system for a jet fighter, or the next exhaust system for a jet fighter. And we did that through several generations, made it better and better and better, to these systems ending up on the F-22 and F-35. That is a core function, I think, of the DoD laboratory, where DARPA is a little bit more about, far term. How do you get away from doing it this way and do it completely different? So I think that's a big difference for me.
I mean, look, there is an easy answer and the reality. The easy answer is that when you look at translational research, you have results and you aim for results in the short term. And versus, as Dr. Walker said, you are going to redefine the field completely. In reality, what happens, and as Dr. Walker said, when you start working on a problem with short-term research solutions, sometimes you are going to hit new ways of rethinking the whole field. This is why I think that ultimately this dichotomy is not a real dichotomy. And there is, even for those interested, there is a book that is very interesting called Pasteur's Quadrant that discusses that very explicitly. So I encourage us all to look at it, but we have to go beyond this idea that there is a dichotomy between the two. It's research and exploration is going to lead us to results, but it's also to lead us to rethink what we have and and create new domains. There is a gentleman already with a mic, and he has.
Hi, my name is Logan McRoberts. I'm a recent graduate from Gonzaga University in Washington State. Dr. Aoun, this is primarily directed towards you, but Northeastern.
If it's tough, please send it to him.
No. He needs more questions.
Yeah, whichever of you feel more suited to answer it. But Northeastern's partnership approach seems exceptionally suited for addressing sort of the technological components of security and innovation, but to what extent does the partnership approach work towards innovative thought on diplomatic efforts that can curb national security threats or aid those technical innovations towards the same ends?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a great question, and the idea is that everything you do has implications for humans and for society and for the global interaction. And that's the quick answer to that. Therefore, you cannot afford to restrict yourself to only a technical domain. The director has mentioned, for instance, ethical AI. You're going to hear more and more about that. Companies, in fact, don't know how to deal with that, and we have a center precisely working on that, bringing the humanists, the social scientists, and the engineers and the computer scientists to work on that. I mentioned the notion of human-centered AI. Same thing. There are enormous implications. I mentioned some implications for the impact on citizens and the workforce. There are other aspects. The Royal Academy this last week issued a whole report on the human-machine interface, where if you're going to have implants, and we have them, and prosthetics, etc. And the director also mentioned how you can start using that to work with machines, thought to work with machines. There are enormous issues of privacies, of control. An employer can start reading your thoughts, etc. They raise questions like this. You cannot now serialize the issues anymore, and that's a great point that you raised. It's at all levels. The human factor has to be at the center of everything we do. As the director said, why is this research being done? for security purposes, for prosperity, and for the well-being of the citizens.
Hi, my name is Kyle Smits from Smits Laboratories. We are an applied research company here in Washington, D.C. We're a service-disabled veteran-owned small business. Our employees are all combat veterans who earned their security clearances through the service of national defense. My question is, how do you look at the risk of small businesses like mine that are very innovative, that are really constrained on funding, and prioritize that risk and funding against organizations like the university that have massive endowments that are looking to keep their student body with interesting things to work on?
Well, at DARPA, it's mostly, since we're focused on proving something can be done, we take a lot of risk with small companies. It's mostly about the ideas that come in. So if you have a great idea, we're willing to listen. And if you can't get a hold of a PM that you're trying to get a hold of, let me know. We have a website. I don't know if you've looked at it, but it's all of our unclassified stuff is on there, and by tech office and broad agency announcement as we publish them. Every office has a 1-year open broad agency announcement all year long that has sort of in general what they're interested in, and so you can send an idea to that anytime. Obviously, it's better to find the program manager in charge of that and talk to them physically before you submit it. But and then they have a certain authority where they can go fund ideas like that and see if they evolve into something bigger. So definitely interested in small companies, especially here in the area.
Let me take a shot at that. You mentioned the term against. With this approach, it's a fail-fail situation. Let me give you an example. No university is self-sufficient. No company is self-sufficient. We all need to work on issues. So if you start with this premise, if we need to work on these issues together, that's the notion of partnership that we discussed. What can we do? What are we doing, for instance, explicitly? I mentioned that we have a campus, focusing on security research. We have incubators precisely for startups, but also we have a place for small companies, and we kept the cost extremely low on purpose in the cost of real estate in order for them to be there, to be embedded, and to work together. Because we don't look at it as either or. We look at it as working together. And that's the approach. So I really encourage you to look at the model where you don't look at the endowment. Some universities have large endowments, some have small endowments. The endowments do not matter. I think what you want to look at is whether there is an interesting project that could bring you and the university or the universities in question to provide solutions and to do what you cannot do on your own and what they cannot do on their own. That's the approach I take, and that's the approach we take.
Let me throw in another from our online watchers. This one's from James Tartaglia, who's a graduate student at American University. It's an excellent question. It says, what advantages do you see in working with foreign allies to solve mutual strategic challenges, such as those with AI, and how do we overcome regulatory barriers regarding these joint efforts? So President Aoun, as someone who is leading a global university, I'm interested in your thoughts, and also Dr. Walker.
You can go first, I'll follow.
Okay, let me give you concrete cases. For instance, we just signed an agreement a month ago involving the universities and in England, Royal Holloway and Imperial College, in Keio in Japan, and another university in Australia, etc. And the whole focus was cybersecurity. I mean, as I said, going back, no university is self-sufficient, and no company is self-sufficient, and the talent, as Dr. Walker said, is going to be global. So we want to bring the talent here, and that's what we're doing. That's what universities do, and would like to continue doing. At the same time, there are opportunities to, going back to the question, to work with allies and friends to further common goals. And that's what's being done.
One of the second pillar of the National Defense Strategy right now is working with allies and partners. And so we take that very seriously. We are working on significant programs, government-to-government programs with Australia, Israel, the UK, but any basic research that's open and publishable anywhere in the world, we will fund. So we can work directly with a university, a company overseas, as long as it's unclassified and open. In fact, we have a company from Australia working on our subterranean challenge right now. So.
And we've got one more question here. I'm going to say we're running out of time, so I think this will be the last question, but please, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. You gentlemen today. My name is Carlos. I'm a Washington lawyer. I was at DOD a while back. I guess my question relates to the tensions being posed in the university by the need for China as a near peer competitor. We talked about just now a question about partners with allies. The thrust of the U.S. government's position in the last year has been, you don't want to be in prison with Huawei, and other Chinese telecom companies, and potentially broader than that. And yet, the university here, on the other hand, that's open to all and focuses more on innovation and more of the work. We talk about Chinese kinds that do R&D there. I'm not sure how you square the two anymore, particularly because it's a procurement ban that's going to get imposed in the next year. That's going to say that any company, anybody who does business and draws on services and equipment of certain Chinese companies, they're not eligible to be a federal contractor. So how would you choose in that regard, President? And is that really what the U.S. wants to do, force choices on people in this way? Really headed toward a real Cold War with China and essentially shutting down high-tech U.S. engagement with China.
I'm going to let you answer that one.
Yeah.
Because you're actually on the front lines.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, this is a delicate situation, and that we are learning here because we start, as Dr. Walker said, we start with looking at talent, no matter where the talent is. That has been our tradition. Now, with the new situation, we are learning that there are other dimensions that we need to add to that. And so it's not only bringing talent, but also, for instance, how, and you heard about it, there are recent cases where some faculty in existing universities also working with other countries were, in trouble. The faculty are in trouble, etc. So this is a new world for us. Do we have answers? No, we don't have all the answers. We're learning. We're learning by working with the various departments. At the same time, the strength of our system has been a system that, as the director said, attracts talents from all over the world, but also retains talent. So that is a big issue for us. When we train talent, no matter where they are from, and after 4 years or 5 years or whatever it is with a BS or an MS or an MA or PhD, we tell them, go away, that we are in some ways not benefiting from the talent that we have formed and we have educated.
That's right.
That's a big issue. That's a big issue. So we shouldn't look at it only in terms of input with respect to talent, but also in terms of output. And what other countries are doing is very revealing. For instance, Canada is saying to the students who apply to Canada, from day one, you will qualify for the green card. This will count towards your green card. Why? Because they are interested in, as you said, Dr. Walker, in not only attracting the talent, but keeping the talent. And I think we have a lot to do to retain the talent here now. Because other countries are becoming much more proactive in providing the opportunities. And that's an issue.
I couldn't agree more with what you said. I think we didn't talk a lot about cybersecurity here today, but there are reasons why. The government's concerned with certain electronics. One of the things we're trying to think about at DARPA is, just like we do on networks, how do you stay secure in an unsecure network? How can we stay secure in 5G, for instance, in a 5G infrastructure that may not be secure? So that's a great, if you have ideas in that space, come talk to us.
All right, well, thank you very much. Before we, hold your applause for one second. I'm going to give you one administrative remark, and then we'll thank our panelists. So we're going to have a short coffee break here. We're going to reset the stage for the next panel. So feel free to stretch your legs, get something to drink, and be back by 11:30 for the start of the next panel. And please join me in thanking Dr. Walker and President Aoun.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. This was great. Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us.
Good. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for facilitating.
Steve, thank you very much.
Some of this wire.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Trip over it here.
All right. Well, I hope everyone got a little bit caffeinated and a little bit stretched out for so you can be ready to go, primed and pumped, and ready to go for our next session. We're joined by another all-star panel. Let me take one moment to pull out the bio so that I don't get this wrong. Starting on my left, we have Dr. Lisa Porter, who's the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering at the U.S. Department of Defense. Prior to her current, where she is responsible for the research, development, and prototyping activities across the DoD enterprise. And also oversees DARPA, Dr. Walker, who was here earlier, the Missile Defense Agency, the Strategic Capabilities Office, and the Defense Innovation Unit. So, and the DoD Laboratory and Engineering Center enterprise. So a lot of the key government partners who are part of this interface and partnership with academia and industry today fall under Dr. Porter's ambit. She has previously served as the Executive Vice President of InQtel and Director of IQT Labs. And numerous other positions, including time as a program manager at DARPA, so steeped in all of these issues. To her left is Dr. David Luzzi, who is the Senior Vice Provost for Research and Vice President of the Innovation Campus at Northeastern University. We heard a little bit about the Innovation Campus earlier. I think we're going to hear a little more about it. Since arriving at the university in 2007 as the Dean of the College of Engineering, he has dedicated himself to kind of pursuing these issues of innovation, collaboration at Northeastern along with his colleagues and helped transform Northeastern into a top-tier research university. New academic programs were launched under his leadership, such as a PhD in bioengineering and a Master's of Science in Energy Systems. To his left is Dr. Robbie Samantha Roy, who is Vice President for Technology within Government Affairs at Lockheed Martin. So his primary responsibilities there include developing and providing technical intelligence and strategy for the Lockheed Martin Corporation, engaging the global S&T ecosystem outside the corporation, including government labs, universities, large and small businesses, and startups, and fostering cross-enterprise innovation within the corporation. He works with other leaders within Lockheed Martin to develop and actively manage enterprise technology roadmaps, and serves as a liaison with non-governmental organizations critical to the formation of S&T. Prior to joining Lockheed Martin, Dr. Samantha Roy was a professional staff member with the Senate Armed Services Committee and also did time, I shouldn't say doing time, also spent some time in the Office of Science and Technology Policy on the White House, where he was in a couple of different capacities there. And to his left is Dr. Bill LaPlante, Senior Vice President and General Manager at MITRE of the National Security Sector. The National Security Sector includes two of MITRE's federally funded research and development centers, or FFRDCs, the National Security Engineering Center and the National Cybersecurity FFRDC. And in this role, Dr. LaPlante is accountable for increasing MITRE's strategic value across the company's U.S. DoD intelligence and cybersecurity portfolios. Prior to that, he has, I should say, more than 30 years of experience in defense technology. And prior to his time at MITRE, served as Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition, where he led the $43 billion Air Force acquisition enterprise budget, bringing it into alignment with the greater Air Force vision and strategy. And we're so glad that all of you could join us and kind of continue this discussion about how we can leverage this partnership between government, industry, and academia for national security purposes. And I have kind of one general question that I want to start with, ask each of you to kind of react to, and then we'll run from there. And the question that I'd like to start with is this. The kind of innovative research that goes into national security missions requires a really high degree of two things that people sometimes can see as being a little bit in tension with each other. You may dispute the premise of that question, but I'm going to throw it out there. And so one is technical rigor, an ability to just be incredibly exacting and getting it right every time. And another is innovation, creativity, the ability to think outside the box. And I should just, I'm going to kind of extemporize here, but one other element that was mentioned earlier also is the need for security and understanding that there are folks trying to get at some of the technology that's being worked on, even as you're dealing with these already challenging complement of capabilities. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts about the unique strengths that each leg of this partnership that we're trying to talk to today bring to this problem, this combination of technical rigor and creativity, innovation, and the need for security, and what synergies that you see happening because there is a partnership, people are working together. And if you wouldn't mind, Dr. Porter,
Oh, you want me
Porter,
to
we'll start with you.
Okay, we're all sitting here like, who goes first? So I guess I would first start off by saying I am in the camp that says those two are not mutually exclusive. So in fact, I think creativity in the absence of rigor is a disaster. Thomas Edison said vision without execution is hallucination. So you always have to bring the scientific method to bear on what you're trying to do. And of course, I'm a big proponent of the Hallmeyer framework, and those of you who are familiar with it, I can see a couple smiles so you know what I'm talking about. That's really about how do you generate the creativity and harness it in a way that allows you to get to an end state or an outcome that is meaningful and impactful. And so I think those things are actually very complementary. If you have one without the other, it usually doesn't work out. From the DoD's perspective, we can't do anything without our partners in academia and industry. And of course, that includes our partners in the FFRDC community as well, in our national labs, et cetera. We have this wonderful ecosystem in the United States that we need to continue to harness and play to each other's strengths as we go forward. So I think it's really obvious that this partnership is extremely vital for our national security.
As the professor here, I guess I'll do what we all do, which is answer your question with questions. And so, you know, and it really is something that frames the way we look at what we do as we've built out partnerships at Northeastern and on the Innovation Campus. What is technical rigor to an academic doing what academics do, and what is technical rigor to a corporation doing, or to the Air Force trying to field a system for the warfighter? What is innovation across those three groups? And what we see is that there's a higher level, if you will, a synergistic level of this technical rigor and innovation that you achieve when you actually develop a theme that I will go back to repeatedly here, which is intimate partnership between these three legs of the stool, especially when that intimate partnership includes co-location and, very importantly, co-responsibility for any program. And the last thing I wanted to, you brought up security, and I want to touch on that also. You know, to our corporate partners, proprietary information is as important to them as classified information is to the federal government. So we take that very seriously, and you must, in order to be successful in partnerships across these three legs, understand where those boundary conditions are and how you get things done in the technical rigor and innovation space within the boundary conditions that you have to do in that security dimension.
Well, Andrew, thank you for this opportunity and joining this esteemed panel. So providing an industrial perspective here, of course informed with my previous Hill and an executive branch experience, I think one of the things that we were talking about just before we got on stage was the sort of the historical importance of an individual that I'm sure many of you know, Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was the presidential science advisor, amongst many other things, including leading NACA and MIT, et cetera, during World War II, and was very seminal in providing this vision called Science, the Endless Frontier in the post-World War II era, and really set up this dynamic ecosystem that Dr. Porter alluded to, where you have government as being an engine for basic research, working very closely with a academic ecosystem, and then dealing with industry to make sure that the products of inventions actually go through an innovation process, which is taking an invention and turning it into something of value, and obviously working with FFRDCs, which are almost in some sense a quasi-academic entity that could provide independent advice and assessments to the government. Now, this was in an environment where, from a threat perspective, we were dealing with the Soviet Union, and in the Cold War, we had the luxury of thinking at the decadal time scale. But what has happened now is, in today's new world, is that the speed at which we need to accelerate these inventions into things of value has become extremely, extremely accelerated. And moreover, this kind of linear process of where you would go from basic research to applied research to some test and evaluation and deployment has now become a very non-linear process. And I think at the heart of this question of rigor versus, if you will, innovation, you're absolutely right, Dr. Porter. It is not mutually exclusive. But I think one of the national security challenges right now is we are so used to flawless execution on very large scale, very expensive systems. Like you launch a spacecraft and God forbid that $1 billion spacecraft goes into the ocean. So you have to really focus on that rigor. On the other hand, you have to unleash the innovation in all of these large bureaucratic organizations and come up with ideas in a very rapid sense that actually solve a problem and not just respond to some broad area announcement has been typically the way that ideas get communicated. So I think it's that speed element that we really have to balance. The last thing I just mentioned, I hope we can talk a little bit more about, is as we talk about all of these entities across your ecosystem, today we face a lot of issues from a conflict of interest perspective. And while we want to make sure that we don't get thrown into jail from some illegal perspective, I think our conversation today should be about a confluence of interest. How, from a national security imperative, we all have a confluence of interest in ensuring that the nation is leading still in basic research and is still, from an applied research and ultimately innovation perspective, taking those inventions and turning them to value to the warfighter, to many other user communities, and doing it in a very rapid way.
Yeah, so I would just echo what partners here have said and colleagues. It is not a choice between rigor and innovation. If you think you're in that choice, you're in the wrong place or you're talking to the wrong people. Let me just say this. I think that all of us in all of our professions in this room know innovative people in our professions. We're the same thing in science and engineering. But if you don't have the rigor, it's game over. It's game over. So, if you just say, well, I'm going to just guess that gravity is 1.8 meters per second squared, but I've got a really innovative concept for a hypersonic ballistic missile, you're game over. You're out of the conversation. So you have to do both. And the truth of the matter is, I think I'm speaking for myself, but many of us, some of the giants in our field have been the ones that have known when to take the time, get the rigor to the precision you need, no more, but get the concept and the innovation right, versus go too far in one or the other direction. That is an incredible skill. Some of the most brilliant analysis and work that certainly I've done by people who are mentors and gods to many of us were done on the back sheet of paper. But they were done rigorously and correctly, and they proved out concepts. And the fact was the individuals that did that knew I could do this on the back of a piece of paper and answer first 2 or 3 questions before I go and have a supercomputer do it. They knew the difference. Very few people know how to do it. So innovation and rigor have to go together. If you don't have rigor, it's game over. It doesn't matter how beautiful the slide is. If you have a cool video, that's great. It doesn't matter. So I would say that. Now, if we're talking about history, they say history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And I would say the other thing we were talking about Bush, we were talking backstage. I've been doing some reading about the so-called fathers of Silicon Valley, Frederick Terman, and for example, he, if you follow he was a sort of a contemporary of Bush. He was maybe a little bit younger as we were talking, and if you know his story, he was at the Harvard Radio Frequency Lab during World War II, and then sort of at the end of the war went back to Stanford and said, okay, let's really show them how it's really done out here on the West Coast, because nobody believes we can do it. And set up what became what we now really the first era of Silicon Valley. One of the key things he did that broke at the time a lot of convention was he believed that the faculty at Stanford needed to be part of industry and vice versa. He wanted them to be on boards, he wanted them to get out there, and vice versa. And there was, as you know, it was an explosion out there in what we now call Silicon Valley. At the time was probably more Microwave Valley. And a lot of these companies, and a lot of the members of those boards, and the people on it were people that were from Stanford and back and forth. They managed the conflict of interest to the point we were just making. And that was so important. So So we have a tradition in this country of doing it and doing it honestly and ethically. The Chinese are doing it. I wouldn't say they're doing it honestly or ethically. But we have a tradition where we can do it, and it's critical to do it for this innovation.
So let's talk a little bit about like the challenges to making that actually work. You know, over the years, it seems like we always find some new way to make these relationships hard. Go back not too far, the Vietnam War kind of drove a wedge between government and academia. The scandals of the 80s and beyond kind of drove a wedge between government and industry about protecting against conflicts of interest and creating a little bit more of an arm's distance links in some instances. Very small example, but here we are having a conference on how to solve the world's biggest problems, and we can't get to it to talk to each other because people are protesting on climate strike, although we did get here, thankfully. But there's all these things that seem to want to drive a wedge and separate the partnership. It has survived, I think, hopefully exemplified by the fact that all of you are here talking about it. But how do you see us needing to, or how do we get past those challenges, those divides that try to pull this partnership apart, and what do we maybe still need to change to get past some of these issues or to manage to work around them so that we can continue the effort?
Do you want to start at the other end?
All right, Bill, it's been nominated that you start this time.
Otherwise, he's always the one who has to come up with something new to say.
I think one of the things that all of us have experienced is when you're really focused on the mission and the national challenge, you sort of figure out the conflict of interest stuff and you get the job done, whether it's across labs or government or industry or whatever. You just do it, and it happens all the time. We don't usually talk about it very much, but it actually is the norm. It's actually the norm. So what causes it to happen? It causes it to happen, number one, is the existential problem we all have. Look, we have, whether we think it's a revision of the Cold War, whatever you want to call it, we're in a global power competition right now with China and Russia. We are. There was a question at the end of the last session about what do we do about academics and dealing with the Chinese, because we still want to be open with the Chinese. There's some of us believe that train has left the station. Okay, so we're in this open competition with China. There isn't any choice. I mean, his company, what we are as an FFRDC, what the government has, and what all of us, we're all in this together. And believe me, the Chinese are right now, they are much more seamless at this. So we have to, number one, recognize the problem. When you go back and you look again at this era before say 1980, before the VCs went into Silicon Valley, it was driven by the existential threat of the Soviet Union. Both industry, commercial, I mean, it was fundamentally about that. Yes, there was profit, but it was driven by that. It was, the VCs got into Silicon Valley in about 1980, then it became more about profit, appropriately so. But I think the thing that starts the whole thing and the conflict of interest thing is forget the rules as much as, not that the rules aren't important, but remember what we're dealing with. We're dealing with something that's existential, in my view, to the industrial base of the United States, to liberal democracy, and that's all of us that have to worry about this. Technological superiority, innovation, it's all of us that have to work together. That's my speech.
Thank you. So I think at the end of the day, the heart of a technology and innovation ecosystem, it's about people. And so at the end, we want to make sure we have the best and brightest that come in. So there's a recruiting and there's a retention and in ensuring that individuals stay within this ecosystem. Now, if you recall, a number of years ago when Dr. Pat Falcone was running the National Security Division at OSTP, one of the things that they're really trying to push that I personally have been very thankful of benefiting from has been the idea of flowing throughout the ecosystem. You go from academia, you go to industry, you go to government, you go to small businesses, and you go to FFRDCs, and you're able to flow, to use almost the word that's used, Bill, seamlessly, again, taking into account, legalities and ethics, but the ability to take your lessons learned, your expertise from one community to another, because the biggest impediment to us to be able to move at scale and at speed is going to be these communities to be stovepipes and not to be able to share solutions, challenges, problems, expertise, and lessons learned. So I think one of the important things is for us to take this sort of enterprise view, and it starts all the way from the beginning when you have individuals that come in from universities into essentially the workforce, whether it's government or private sector, and then the ability for government and industry and academia to go back and forth. So if you're in academia, you do an IPA, you go into government. You become a special government employee. One of the things, I'll just give a shout out here to Dr. Phil Perconti, the director of the Army Research Lab, and his predecessor, Dr. Tom Russell. Their whole open campus initiative for the Army Research Lab was about getting Army researchers out into industry, getting industry researchers to get into their lab environment. These are the things that we need to embrace and espouse. And to be able to take these lessons learned and move across. Go into government, work in a government laboratory, go work in government leadership, provide that expertise, and be able to be a tractor to the young generations that are going to come in your footsteps and to contribute across that enterprise. So I think there really has to be a full court press, that there's obviously executive policies. The Hill has to essentially look at a few authorities and various things that can help on this front. And industry has to see in the long term, it's their financial, it's their benefit, it's an incentive to be able to attract great people to come and work, even if it's temporarily, because we no longer work in a paradigm where a young professional is going to stay in one position in one organization for their entire life.
So, gosh, we're raising a whole bunch of really interesting issues here. There is a pool of tremendously well-prepared technical talent around the world. And as Dr. Walker said in the last session, and you have said, we want to tap into that. We must do that. We must protect what we need to protect. And we must provide the possibility for the United States to harvest, maybe not a perfect term, harvest that tremendous technical talent as we have to our great benefit for decades. I think moving beyond, very important by the way, this cycling through the different sectors. But I think we're also moving beyond that, and I think, again, to Dr. Perconti's credit, we see now that it's not just about Army Research Lab folks working out in industry or in academia, but it actually is this idea of getting the Army Research Lab out of its fence, if you will, and placing outposts. I mean, just, forward operating bases. I mean, what extended campuses, right? Out around the country, and that's where I think this subject of today's talk, is very important. Beyond cycling people through, which is very important, there is also this growing move towards figuring out how to do really effective partnerships. And I think that is something that's quite powerful. I want to add one more thing in. So we have had a bit of a luxury in this country of being well in advance and not really having what you might call peer competitors in the S&T space. And now that is becoming more of a great power conflict in the S&T space. And with a potential adversary or a growing adversarial relationship with a country that has the economic heft, which back in the day was an Achilles heel of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union could not measure up in economic heft. Now it's different. So we also have to get better at our execution. And you touched on this at the very end, but I kind of call this sand in the gears. So in the last session, we talked about how do we get better at retaining that talent. Right now, we do have a system that is biased towards chasing the talent away after they finish their academic preparation. We need to figure out how to get better at retaining that talent. I would also say, with the way government interacts with industry and academia, government right now has too much sand in the gears in terms of the cumbersome processes, especially around contracting. Yet we're starting to see DARPA is, instituting this new program in AI with this metric of 90 days to contract. The Air Force was on our campus up in Burlington and ran a, what do you call it, session?
A pitch session.
Pitch, yes, thank you. Pitch session with companies. And the longest it took for them to get a contract executed was 4.5 minutes. Because they found some way to do it on a charge card. I don't know who got the miles for all those contract dollars, but they were, that was a joke, by the way. I don't think there were miles involved. But anyway, the point is, people are trying to find new mechanisms to do things, but I think we have to really do a hard scrub on the way we execute in this nation and get better at that.
Right, so it's hard to be fourth because now I have to come up with something that they didn't already say that's really ingenious, right? So I think
For you, this is a walk in the
park. Oh, that's really sweet. So I think I'll add a couple things. Conflict of interest is one of these things that people hide behind. It's actually a very important principle, and really it's all about making sure that someone doesn't have an unfair competitive advantage. And when you're the person who doesn't get to have that unfair competitive advantage, or the entity, it's, your rights you feel violated because you don't have access to the same level of knowledge or insight or whatever that someone who has that unfair competitive advantage has. And that's not in the interest of our country. We actually believe in things like full and open competition, competition for ideas, the rule of law, intellectual property. These are our strengths that China does not hold dear. And we need to make sure that we distinguish ourselves and continue to distinguish ourselves by holding those principles central to how we operate. So the conflict of interest principle, I think, is something we should all get behind, which is let's ensure that people have fair, open access to new opportunities, because frankly, that's how the government gets the best and brightest ideas. Now that said, what happens is people use that, as they do with human nature being what it is, as an excuse for, well, I can't work with you, or I'm afraid. A lot of fear of I'm afraid to do this or that. And I think we just, in leadership, whether we're leaders in industry, academia, or government, we have to have courage to understand the principle and act accordingly and ethically, but to engage, as all of these guys have said, around different ways of engagement. I fully support, by the way, your point about we need to be the beacon for best and brightest. We should want people to come here and stay. That should be our goal. We should double down on that goal. If the Chinese want to send their best people here, great, let them stay. And I will tell you that the smartest person I've ever known in my life, and I've known a few, was from China. And he was amazing. And he came to MIT, and he stayed. Thank God for us. So there's nothing wrong with that model. We should double down on that model. We should put that emphasis at our universities. Come, stay here. We are the best country. You will thrive here. Your genius will be rewarded here. Your hard work will be rewarded here. That's what we stand for as a country. And that's why we're attractive. And I hope that as we go forward, we continue to embrace that. So perhaps that's a little Pollyannish, but that's how I feel.
So one of the things that really struck me in the first panel discussion, and I already said it once, but I'll say it again, was this concept that Dr. Walker talked about seeding the technology space. So not just declaring in the National Defense Strategy, even though doing so was important, that there are emerging technologies that are key to the future of national security that we need to make sure the U.S. plays a leadership role. And there's a beautiful list in the National Defense Strategy. And if I tried to say it all from memory, I'd probably miss out on a few. But it's ones that people focus a lot on: artificial intelligence, human-machine teaming, hypersonics, directed energy. So that's obviously critically important. And I guess my question is, well, I guess I should say, you hear a lot of discussion right now that we have kind of lost our edge in doing this. Historically, the United States had a world-leading capability to do this, to identify a new area of emerging technology and kind of take a leadership role through some combination of deep investment and the inherent native expertise and imported expertise from the rest of the world. And there's kind of an idea out there that we have lost our edge on this. And so number one, and that's not so much a question of, well, are we still leading on AI as much as have we lost our edge institutionally among the partners represented here to still do this, to still take a leadership role when it's a priority to us. to do so? And secondly, what challenges or what things do we need to fix to make sure that, that we can stay in that capability? So this time I'd ask you.
Okay. So again, I actually don't think we've lost our edge, but I think we are in danger of that. So I don't think all is lost. Certainly in areas like AI, the United States is actually very strong. But we do have to ensure that we stay in that leading position. I'm sure if you ask Steve Walker, he would also emphasize this point. One of our secret sauce ingredients in this country is DARPA. And if you look across the world, many have tried, and no other country has succeeded. And there's a reason for that. Again, DARPA understands inherently in its culture that it is the font of early stage, high risk research that then, to Robbie's point, then takes advantage of saying, okay, commercial sector, over to you. You productize this, you create all of the innovation around the initial concepts, and we'll get out of your way, and we'll keep churning that innovation. We have this private sector that knows how to leverage that investment better than any other country in the world. It is a magical thing that we do, and as long as we continue to invest in that ecosystem, I think we are going to be very successful. Now, the NDS was, I think, very well timed to say, look, we need to be strategic. We can't be sitting back on our heels anymore, sort of going, hey, look how great we are. We've got to get focused. We've got to recognize where our near-peer adversaries are actually doing very well and ask ourselves, how do we make sure that we jump out ahead? And whether you're talking about 5G or hypersonics, these are areas where we are saying, look, we've got to make sure we take a leadership position. But we have the ability to do that. I strongly believe that.
So, yeah, I would like to raise an issue that, how is our challenge as a nation today different than our challenge in the past? Well, there's always been the bleeding edge of technology that was, certainly in terms of security, whether it was your tribe back when tribes were important or the nation state today. Throughout human history, there's always been this technology imperative. Not too many decades ago, that technology imperative was focused very much in the domain of math and physics. And today, this technology imperative has broadened tremendously. If you look through history, there is a very strong correlation between the size of a particular population, whether it be tribe or nation, and success in the world of geo-competition or local tribal competition. So we also have to take a look at that and think back to what we were just talking about in terms of attracting and retaining talent. We have a challenge. I don't disagree that we are at the cutting edge and executing. The challenge we have is we need to be at a much broader front line of technological edge and be pushing in all of these, because all of these areas today are critically important. So we have to, as universities, do a better job in terms of increasing the number of students from not just the STEM fields, but into policy and the humanics, very important. And it's not just that we have this broad technological frontier that we must cover as a nation, but also the convergence between the two. AI and biotech, huge challenge for the future. We are building out a whole effort at Northeastern specifically around that direction, because we recognize these important areas for the future. So we have a serious challenge here. I agree absolutely that as a nation we are at the cutting edge. Are we at the cutting edge in enough locations? That is what we have to work on, and the things we just talked about before are the things that we need to address that.
So one of the previous directors for research and then innovation at the Office of Naval Research, Dr. Larry Schutte, who I have the honor of coming and working with me a couple years ago, likes to say that the Defense Department is the first to invent and the last to adopt. And what he was really getting at was the rich, if you will, basic research, if you will, environment that DoD, along with the National Science Foundation, and many people, by the way, forget that in the charter of the National Science Foundation, there is an imperative to also do basic research for national security purposes. So the bottom line is that you have this rich sort of basic research environment, and you're right, if you look at things like in AI, where the defense establishment funded a lot of the early elements of computer science and mathematics and logic, etc. But then where's that, if you will, pull that will get into something, into a program of record or ultimately a product? That's where things have really slowed down and bogged down. And so really at the end, the question becomes, in today's new, very fast-paced world, how does the government work with industry to send out that signal and say, we have got to get to these technologies into products and fielded to the warfighter, intelligence analysts, the supply chain in a very fast, rapid manner. So that's one of our big challenges. The second thing I'd also identify is talking about that broad technology waterfront. One of the other things that is significantly different today than in Vannevar Bush's era is the presence of venture capital and private equity and just this private sector, and even the existence of like an InQtel that's working with a very interesting ecosystem that is not, it's not inventing, but it's taking things and fielding them very fast and taking advantage of the latest advances, if you will, in computer hardware, software, etc. This is where the department has also not kept up with the latest advances. And so I think it's that element of how we have to work across that broad front. So for instance, the department has the department, or in the intelligence community, has had things like InQtel and other things, DIUX, the Defense Innovation Unit. On the industry side, we've been having to respond to create things like Lockheed Martin Ventures, or Boeing has their Horizon X, et cetera. So you have across the industrial front, you have these entities that are trying to interface with the venture capital community, put in investments, bring in technology at a faster pace. And I think that new dynamic that, for instance, the Defense Innovation Board has been trying to push the department in is something that we really have to basically capitalize on. As well as from an academic perspective, the rich ecosystem of spin-outs that have been coming out from universities. So that's an interesting new dynamic that I think we're still gelling on specific technological areas.
Yeah, and I would just say that we should, again, with mindful of the conflict of interest, we should really welcome the spin-outs. We should really welcome the flow back and forth between these different communities. I was talking to a colleague who's with the University of Michigan in artificial intelligence. He said that, I'm going to get this wrong, about what percentage of academics around the country that are in artificial intelligence that are either dual-hatted or have left academia and gone out into starting their own companies. Well, you want them to be able to come back, but that's actually not a bad thing. That's actually potentially a really, really good thing. So that is something that we should encourage. There's another piece of this that I want to mention that can help with the going back and forth, and I'm going to finish this later, is the sense of getting the technical person, the innovation, close to the operational problem, to see the problem itself, to see actually what the analyst is struggling with that needs artificial intelligence, to see what's going on in space, to see what's going on in cyber. If you're removed from it, if you're only, you don't understand it. When I spent 25 years at Johns Hopkins APL, my first 5 years riding submarines as a physicist, I tell you, to this day, I am not an operator or a Navy operator, but I certainly understand what they're dealing with. And it helped me tremendously. We took it for granted. That type of program of getting the scientists and technologists back and forth between the operators is, I think, really important. The final point I'll make, which gets back to this cutting edge thing, it's a cliche to say we should pick the areas that we really, no kidding, want to be number one and want to stay number one at. That is, the job that Lisa's in right now. That is part of what her and Mike Griffin, have to really focus. What is the thing that's really important? So here's some examples. AI and machine learning. Is it the most important to win the race on counter AI, counter AI? Who goes back and forth? Who wins that counter game? That may be the arms race in AI or machine learning. What is it though that we don't want to have second to the United States in? Each one of those domains. The other piece of this, which has changed in the last 20 years, is things that we now would put into systems engineering or systems design or systems thinking would have been considered soft sciences to those of us in physics and math 20 years ago. Cognitive engineering. That would have been, oh, that's soft. It's not soft, actually. The understanding of how the human mind works, how decisions are made, how thinking is done, how situations work, there's a lot of understanding of that now. And really what you're talking about now is multidisciplinary. very multidisciplinary. So what are the multidisciplines that we want to be number one and still continue to be number one, and how do we incubate and flow people across it? That's what we have to do as a country. We haven't lost our edge, but if we don't do something, we're at risk of losing our edge.
Well, I want to open up to audience questions. Time flies when you're having fun, and you have 4 good panelists, so we've reached that stage. I do want to remind folks that we will take online questions, and the link for that is on our chart up here and on our page online. We're also going to do more old school microphone questions in the room as well. Let me start here on the aisle.
Hi, Scott Massioni with Federal News Network. This is for Dr. Porter. Recently, the Defense Innovation Unit came out with a report on how they've been dealing with their contracts and everything lately. It seems like about 23% of their prototypes have gone on to be fielded or gone on to contract. And also with that, it looks like their average data contract was about 187 days, something that they said they want to work on. Anyway, I was wondering how DoD is looking at this in the sense of risk, in the sense of success for DUI. I realize it's an N equals 1 sort of problem, but are you satisfied with how things are going? Thank you.
Sure. So DIU is an example, which of course Robbie was highlighting as well, of trying to figure out how to bring that innovation into the DoD. That quote about how we're really good at inventing and then somehow we don't capture it is absolutely right on point. So we recognize that. And we want to be able to capture a lot of that innovation back into the department through these companies that exist that normally would never think to do business with the DoD. And to your point, it's really hard to do business with the DoD. So DIU, I think, is still improving. I think at some level, if you ask myself or Mike Brown, we're never going to be satisfied because we're always going to be pushing those metrics that you were citing. But I think given how young it is as an organization, it's made great strides in those metrics that matter. How fast is it able to get things back into the DoD? And frankly, just the ability to show the what we call the non-traditional companies out there, meaning from a DoD-centric world, they're not part of the defense industrial base. How we show them that it's actually possible to work with DoD, and there actually is a mechanism to go from a one-off to something that becomes a multi-opportunity, right? Because you can't make money on 1 or 2 things, right? You've got to ultimately be able to scale, and that's what you're getting to with your question about fielding, and that's really important. So I think DIU is still making the progress, but we're pleased with the vector, the direction it's going in. And again, the director there, Mike Brown, I think is doing a really good job in keeping that organization focused on delivery much faster. And again, I can't emphasize enough your point, Robbie. You're absolutely right. The traditional acquisition in DoD is still, unfortunately, from our early days 20 years ago, we used to hear about how it was broken, and it's still broken. So, but DIU is one of those examples we hope we can replicate and expand.
Let me ask one of the online questions, and then I'll come to one here in the room. So this one's from Justin Doubleday, Inside Defense, who's watching online. And he's asking about the quote-unquote zero trust model for security in areas like cybersecurity, microelectronics, 5G, and Dr. Walker earlier made reference to the need to be able to operate on an unsecure network with enough security to accomplish national security missions. So the question then is, what is the status of efforts to be able to do that, to be able to operate in a zero trust world across a range of technologies? And I would maybe, if you don't mind, Dr. Porter, we'll start with you, but I think that might be something the whole panel would want to.
So yeah, so this is something I'm very much behind. I remember back in the day when I started IARPA, well, I was the first director of IARPA back in 2008, and at that time, cybersecurity became really, really important. So it had been important before, but people were really emphasizing it. And unfortunately, there was a huge emphasis on primitive defense models, right? So we were thinking about it, as long as we can construct perimeters, everything inside will be safe, and including the data, the networks. And then, of course, turns out that isn't such a smart way of thinking, because it leads you to a false sense of security. And if you don't know what I mean, think Edward Snowden. So then we said, wow, maybe this perimeter defense model has some flaws in it, and people in the cybersecurity realm in particular started really thinking about, we can't assume just because we're inside a perimeter or a wall that everything is safe, that we can trust the people, and that we can ensure that the networks are all good. Instead, we should probably assume that our networks are compromised. And by the way, all of you in the private sector in particular, you all know that you have to assume your networks are compromised, and the Chinese, just like they're listening now, are listening to everything you say, or reading everything you write. So when you change your mindset to, wow, I have to assume that my networks aren't trusted, that no matter where I am, I've got to go in with an assumption that I can't trust what I am using as the backbone of my communications, it changes how you think about the technological solution. And it actually opens up your sort of aperture of how will I approach this. And so in the past few years, you've seen people really advocating zero trust architectures that people didn't call it that before, but that's really where the mindset shift came was, wow, I think we've been lulling ourselves into a false sense of security by thinking we can build perfectly secure enclaves. There is no such thing as a secure system. As a physicist who's trained, that's called epsilon goes to zero, right? It just doesn't happen. So we have to deal with that reality, and whether we're doing cyber, whether we're doing supply chain, whether we're doing 5G, wherever you are in that space, you've got to be mindful of, I can't assume I can build something secure, so how do I deal with that reality? And open your aperture to thinking about, how do I make measurements? How do I do a risk management approach? Where do I target my resources? What are the things that are most important to protect, and how do I approach that? And once you do a risk management approach, you suddenly realize, oh, there is a way to manage this. And there is a way to deal with that without having a heart attack about the difficulty of the problem. So you will see in R&E, you will see the zero trust reference across many of our domains, because we're really trying to advocate for that perspective.
Miter next.
Well, I think that this is a minor, just as general, to Lisa's point, I think that that's where we're going to have to be with 5G, not just as a DoD, but as a country. I mean, we're just going to have to assume it's zero trust. And so, to me, the interesting thing is what are the technical concepts that we have? What's the affordability of them? And then how do we get to the point of where you pay for how much trust? How much zero trust is, if it's
yes.
Whatever. That's the piece where this needs to go. But it's, for the first time, I think, the right question is being posed.
Right.
It is being described the right way. It is what we need to engineer. It is the thing, for example, that could be the thing that we say we're going to win. We're going to win the race to zero trust architectures. We win that race, we're, as a country, we've won. So I just think it's really, really important. And again, nobody anymore should be saying, I've got the solution that'll keep them off your network. It just doesn't,
right.
They're not, that is an epsilon goes to zero. I mean, that is a zero.
So piling onto that from a perspective from industry, the defense industrial base, absolutely we have to work hand in glove with our government customers. And for instance, the DoD CIO, Dina Deasy, working very closely with our CIO, Jim Connolly, and our CISO, our Chief Information Security Officer, are working very closely to ensure that there's openness, transparency, understanding the nature of the threat, and working across actually the industry consortium, because it's important that, again, the defense industrial base, not only just the traditional defense industrial base, but many of the new traditionals that are coming on board the supply chain ecosystem are going to actually be protected, and that we have this open, transparent conversation with the government on what the threats are and what we're doing about it. The other key thing that I would also, if you will, mention on this perspective is there still is a lot of runway from the research perspective, as has been alluded to my colleagues here. And the other thing I would shout out is, DARPA a number of years ago started also biologically inspired ways to think about networks, of how the diversity across the networks could potentially be an impediment for viruses and other malware to spread, very rapidly. So that, I think, is another important area. And then lastly, I think the whole notion of cyber awareness and consciousness is something that has to be ingrained now, actually from a STEM education perspective, all the way down to like high school students and less, because this is a new reality that we live in today. And what really worries me on this kind of the cyber front is now the whole emerging world of deep AI fakes, and how do you actually tell the difference between something that's real or machine generated, especially when it can have a huge influence on social media networks, etc. So there's one other perspective, if you will, on this really interesting domain.
So, if I could just touch on that last thing you said. You mentioned STEM, and I want to make sure that people don't get caught up on that word, because really what we're talking about here in this last thing about protecting society, if you will, against threats that are coming over the networks. We're really talking about resilience of society, and we have to make people, not just people focused in STEM, but across the entire population, and a lot earlier than kindergarten, right? Because that's when kids first are going online now, to really start getting to a place where we have a much more resilient society with regard to cyber. I want to bring up one important thing. So, touching on what you said before in terms of getting out on the submarine, that's very important. So we've taken an approach at Northeastern to get out with the operators, if you will, and it's non-trivial to get some of the operators to agree to have, I'm going to use a pejorative here, nerds from academia come.
Breathing our air, eating our food.
Right, exactly. But
never heard it.
But so for example, as an example, we spent a week at Camp Lejeune during Bold Alligator 2014 looking at how the Marines exercise in the cyber domain at the tactical front. Yeah. And from that, we developed a program, which is now a large Navy-funded program in expeditionary cyber. When everything we've talked about here is about the network. Well, what when you're out at the tactical edge, when you have autonomous systems, they are developing, you're setting up ad hoc networks all the time. So you have these ad hoc security of those ad hoc networks very often are not going to be able to be connected back to the big internet, back to the big DoD network. This is a big challenge. Also, our existing networks at the tactical edge that are normally designed to be connected back to the big DoD network are not going to be able to guarantee that they have that connectivity. So how do we handle these challenges of robust network security in these very important to the DoD especially, but I would argue also important in terms of disaster response, et cetera. I mean, there was cyber attacks that happened against folks trying to rescue people in Katrina. I mean, okay, so there's people out there doing stupid stuff. We have to be, ready for that type of thing for all these dimensions. So before you mentioned the warfighter and the intelligence operator, I also add in the Homeland Security practitioner into that group of terms of very important customers.
Absolutely. I want to try and fit in one more question with Sydney.
Sydney Freed for Breaking Defense. A question primarily for Dr. Porter, but I'm just all taking it.
Director Walker said interesting things about biotech, and I've heard a lot of people sort of looking over the shoulder of our current obsession with AI at, CRISPR-Cas9 and either performance augmentation or immune boosting, things of that kind. For DoD, how does that next wave differ from what you need to do to? I mean, it's hard enough to deal with AI and AI innovation. How do you deal with this next wave of innovation that's even more inextricably tied with non-military applications where there are even more ethical concerns? I mean, forget privacy. When you talk about gene editing, is much more complicated. How is that a larger challenge, or perhaps even a larger payoff than the current AI wave to deal with the biological wave?
So the scientists in me just get super excited about these really emerging technologies. But you're right; they have both the opportunity and they have the challenge. And biotech, as you correctly identified, just like AI, a lot of the innovation and the expertise, if you will, is out in the private sector right now. Now, we do have excellent expertise in DoD in these areas as well, but we recognize biotech is an area that we want to make sure that we are staying ahead of. And what people don't realize, and myself included, because I'm not a biologist, I'm a physicist, so I'm just getting educated on all this by smart people, there's a lot of opportunities in the biotech domain in terms of generating new materials and new capabilities. So we typically think about, when we think biotech and DoD, we think, okay, chem biodefense. And that's an element of the problem, but there's also a lot of opportunity space that people don't necessarily realize unless they talk to the biologists about what gets them excited about synthetic biology. So we will be focusing not just on the traditional elements of biotech that we always do, but we'll be expanding into what are the opportunities for new materials, for new applications. I don't know if Dr. Walker went into that at all, but one of the programs that they did looks at runways, building runways automatically, essentially, very quickly. There's a lot of great activity that we need to figure out how to expand on and scale up, because there's tremendous opportunity for functionality that we currently don't have access to through that domain. And in fact, I think Dr. Picanti is well aware of this because ARL has some really unique expertise in this area. So he's nodding up and down because I guess I'm not saying something too stupid, right? Okay. As a physicist, I'm always worried about trying to pretend I know anything about biology, but it's a very exciting domain, obviously. So you will see a lot of activity in that from the DoD going forward.
You did mention human augmentation as one that gets people most worried.
It does. And that's where a lot of the media press is. And of course, you read about what China is doing, and we should be concerned because they don't have the same set of moral and ethical norms that we have in our country. But I think that and this is an area I hope you can comment on from the academic perspective, a lot of our deep-seated capability is in academia on the entire spectrum of what's possible, including the augmentation elements that you referenced. Did you want to add?
No, absolutely. And I think, a lot of that work that's coming out of the university is being driven by, for example, stroke victims and things like that. So really, how do you drive in a very positive way for the benefit of people these technologies? But as Dr. Walker said, and I think we all agree, technology is technology, and as it advances, bad people can use it for bad things, and good people have to both develop it for good things and also develop the counters to the bad people developing it for bad things. So this is
well said. Yes.
A challenge for us.
And clearly, I mean, this has been made, this point made many times, is that the large data part of this biology situation is not unlike some of the other AI machine learning things we're looking at. It may be about a data problem when you look at the results of the Human Genome Project and all the collection of all of our DNA and what can be done with that large data. I have a colleague of mine who believes the CRISPR developments over the past 5 years may in fact be the biggest breakthrough in history when we look back at this era. So it's of that magnitude. And I just finished with a quasi-humorous anecdote from a bunch of several physicists were involved in a study. I was one of them. And we had a biologist there, a human biologist. We were talking about human cognition and augmentation. And we were talking about a certain capability that might give it 10 or 15% better human performance. And us physicists said, well, what's that? That's not an order of magnitude. I mean, we look at orders of magnitude. And this guy stared at us and goes, that's not a human, that's a different species. So it is a totally different domain than what we're used to thinking about.
Yes.
But just to kind of finish up on that front from an industrial aerospace and defense perspective, just to foot stomp what Lisa mentioned about, we see there's great potential in the future as sort of an emerging frontier for advanced materials, yes, adaptive materials from an aerospace perspective, as well as sensing. And I think the important thing on this frontier is there's a convergence of many different fields. You have they call it systems biology or synthetic biology, you have engineering, you have computational science, big data, even nanoelectronics. They're all converging, and I think the application space is so rich, we can't even here sit and conceive about where this field will be going in the next 10 years or so.
Yes, absolutely.
And can I just add one thing here?
One more thing.
Okay, so I'm gonna bring it back to partnerships.
Okay.
Because that is what the title of this thing is all about here, right? So as this convergence happens, I want to give an example of an advanced material that was created and the benefit of partnerships when you co-locate and have co-responsibility. So we had a classic academic result. A new material was developed for a particular application, and it made a great paper. It was funded by the National Science Foundation. It used, I'm not joking, the most expensive element in the periodic table, and also required a material that is considered a strategic risk. That means it is only available from certain countries that are potentially adversaries. So a corporate partner looking at these properties said, this is fabulous, but not tenable for two reasons. Okay, so what they did was they created a joint project, co-located, co-responsible, led by both the faculty member and a PhD from the company. And they had dual responsibility, dual reporting responsibility to the vice president of R&D of the company and to me as senior vice provost for research to make this research project a success. And in 11 months, they solved how to get very close to the properties with substitutes that were economical and non-strategic. But then the company funded another thing to take it from a volume which was just barely measurable to the largest that could be done in the academic laboratory given the equipment that was in the laboratory. And that involved real science around diffusion, et cetera, to solve. And that was solved in 3 months. And then the company then had invested in a bunch of equipment to scale it up to the point at which the P&L would take it on. So if they could solve it at that scale. All along the way, there were postdocs and PhD students involved, and then when it became a company project to scale it up to the level that would go to the P&L, the actual part of the company that makes it at railroad car volumes, they used undergraduate students in our cooperative education program as the engineering workforce to work with the company engineers to get that scaled up. Then it was transition. 22 months between discovery and transition. It's unheard of for a new material. And the company transitioned the people along with it. And that's where you start getting real power in terms of partnerships. So the PhD level, everybody's a kid to me these days. The PhD level kids and the undergraduate kids all transitioned on as part of this project going into this company for integration and then sale into the marketplace. So that's a great example of how partnerships can really drive advanced technology.
Can you name the company and describe the material?
No. Well, unfortunately, we don't have time for that right now. But I want to alert you to the fact we do have another speaker. We have my colleague, Dr. Kathleen Hicks, who's going to give some concluding remarks. So please do not leave when this panel is done. And we're going to bring the podium forward so she has a place to speak. But please do thank me and join the panel for a fascinating discussion.
Great.
Good job.
You always have to have an academic on your panel to make it run over.
That's great. Oh, you did great. So,
Pleasure. Yeah.
Don't worry, you don't have to wait long. It's really just my pleasure to thank everyone who participated today. What a great entrance into the Implementing Innovation series that Andrew and his team have put together, and great job by the DIG team in doing so. I especially want to thank our co-hosts at Northeastern University, President Aoun, Dr. Steve Walker from DARPA, and all the panelists that have participated today, Sean OKeefe, who gave the opening remarks today. I think what's really important about this conference is it's always so, interesting in Washington for people to focus on the technologies themselves. And of course, those are really important. But what this conference and the whole series gets to is creating an innovation ecosystem is about so much more than the technology itself. And these partnerships, whether they're academic to government, private sector, commercial private sector, with academia, with folks like us, with government, are a critical component to making sure that we're developing the talent, growing out that basic research and development, and thinking through all the challenges in terms of getting that strategic edge on innovation, both in defense and where necessary in offense. So again, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you again to Andrew for emceeing us through the day. And join me in a round of applause for the folks who put together this conference.